Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to this special stream with my guests Horus and Ataman on British policy 1914-41 and Winston Churchill. This is part 3 of the stream. The links to the other 2 parts are in the description, and there's also some links to some of Horus's social media stuff as well. How you going, Horus? How you going, Ataman?
Yeah, could you?
Oh yeah, I'm fine, man. Horus, how you going?
Doing well, lads. Yeah, thanks. Good to be back. Obviously, I caused us to delay a week or 2, but yeah, looking forward to it.
Oh, look, mate, you can't help it if you're starting a new job. I mean, none of us 3 are full-time YouTubers, so you know we all have other lives to do around them. So there's not much we can do about that. Okay, for anyone who wants reminding, we got up to the remilitarization of the Rhineland last week, pretty much, and a little bit beyond that. We looked at how Britain fairly deliberately caused Italy to become an enemy, and how Japan had gradually turned into at least a potential enemy following the Washington Naval Treaty and the ending of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance. So this week, I thought we'd move on to the period around the situation in Czechoslovakia that led up to Munich and this kind of stuff. Oh, well, actually, I suppose we've got to mention briefly the Anschluss in Austria. Basically, Austria, which was German-speaking, and of course, Adolf Babes was actually originally an Austrian himself. Austria was dead keen to merge back with Germany, and the German army invaded the place, and it was extremely peaceful. Most Austrians were quite in favour of it. Would that be a fair summary, gentlemen?
Yeah. Go on, Ataman. Were you going to speak?
No, yeah, it sounds about right to me. Yeah, I think so.
Look, I'm well aware that if you want to find out about the history of this pre-war era, there is a lot of content on even on YouTube, and like the Anschluss, the merger between Austria and the German Reich is pretty non-controversial in most respects, to be honest with you.
It was there was some controversy a couple of years ago about it between me and Brutus, actually. When I made a series of I don't know if he's listening. He should do, because Brutus always sort of tussled with me on this stuff, and he's quite good at it as well. We had a really good debate one time, but yeah, he thought the Anschluss was pretty outrageous. I mean, it was definitely like Hitler kind of strangling Versailles to death, but then a lot of people think that wasn't such a bad thing, even from British perspective and all this. But like, yeah, I mean, there was some. I mean, like the Austrian, you could say the Austrian leadership was treated pretty badly from various quarters. I mean, the Austrian Nazi Party behaved very roughly. I think they killed some people in terrorist campaigns and stuff like that. So there was some like scandalous things going on. On the other hand, I don't know how much sympathy. I haven't studied Austrian politics of the 20s and 30s really, but I don't know how much sympathy is due to the leaders if, as seems the case, a large majority of Austrians were happy to reunite with, not just Germany but Hitler's Germany.
Who wasn't happy with it was Mussolini, of course, who actually sent troops to the Brenner Pass in the Alps.
Yeah, and he was trying to show that Austria he considered to be in his sphere, right?
Yeah, and also obviously that was going to bring the German border up to his border. And prior to World War II, Mussolini and Hitler did not always get on very well. And of course, Britain and France were willing to do nothing. And at that stage, they could have got the Italians on side with them had they wanted to, but they were not interested.
I think. Sorry, you go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, was the Strasser front had that sort of dissolved by this point?
Well, really, it was this that resulted in it dissolving.
The Anschluss, particularly.
Yeah, and the fact that no one backed up Mussolini, and of course, even when Mussolini invaded Abyssinia, Hitler originally sent armaments to the Abyssinians.
Never knew that.
Wow. Yeah, look, he actually sent arms shipments, mostly small arms and machine guns and so on, to Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Abyssinia, against the Italians.
That's quite something, isn't it?
The Italian and the Italian fascists and the German National Socialists didn't get on all that well until well, at any stage really, but I mean certainly not until World War II broke out.
Yeah, when the war did break out, it was generally a case of Germany kind of sorting out problems that their alliance with Italy caused, right?
There you go. Mitch in the chat is saying he sent 10,000 Kar 98 rifles to Ethiopia.
Well,
So,
Yeah, that's
there
what I
we
do
go.
when I play as Britain in Hearts of Iron 4.
Well, I listen. If it was me, I wouldn't do anything about Ethiopia because I actually think the Italians probably ran it better
Yeah.
than the Ethiopians. So but that's just me.
But yeah, I mean, I've never really bought into this whole Anschluss as a trigger for World War II thing.
No.
I mean, that being said, I understand why at the time it caused some tension. I know that Mussolini particularly was outraged about, the Austrian leadership being brutally killed in the way it was. But that was by Austrian National Socialists, who apparently Hitler was
Yeah.
pretty incensed by.
Yeah, he wasn't very keen on what the Austrian National Socialist Party was doing at all. He thought they were giving the Germans a bad name.
They were, by the sounds of it, they were quite wild. Like A.J.P. Taylor's history says roughly the same. That they actually kind of triggered in some ways. They triggered the whole crisis, to which Hitler responded, quite opportunistically. I think obviously wanted to unite the countries, but I don't think he had an easy way to do so. And their actions provoked, I think, was it Dollfuss or Schuschnigg? I can't remember which way round now. But to do things that pissed off the Austrian people and kind of helped drive them into Hitler's arms. So, sort of useful, embarrassing, but also part of the dynamic that actually led to giving him the opportunity. But yeah, I think we all roughly agree on this one, didn't we?
Yeah, pretty much. Hardeman's just pointing out in the chat that the Germans also, including under Hitler, supported the Chinese against the Japanese up until 1938.
Really?
Yeah. There were whole regiments of the nationalist Chinese army, and don't forget these were the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. They weren't the communists, but there were whole regiments of the nationalist army who were called German regiments because most of their equipment was German, including the helmets. They had the German steel helm.
Was the Chinese Civil War underway by then? That went through a lot of the 30s, didn't it?
No, the Chinese Civil War really was like post-World War II, because that was when the Chinese were fighting the Chinese nationalists who are now on Taiwan were fighting the communists.
Yeah, because it's in that sort of short period, isn't it, between World War II and Korea?
Yeah.
And it's sort of over by the time Korea rears around.
Yes. Pretty much,
and then China got involved in the Korea War, didn't they? Communist China, obviously.
They sure did, and at some stage we may even do a stream or two on the Korean War, because the British and Commonwealth troops play quite a big part in that, which these days is mostly forgotten. But we may do a stream on that at some stage. But as I said, things were not as simple as people looking back on it now sometimes pretend. Because you've got the Germans under Adolf Hitler supporting the Abyssinians against the Italians and supporting the Chinese against the Japanese up until the 1930s, to the late 1930s. So it's quite interesting.
That is unexpected. I think obviously like Hitler's sort of generalized racism has been exaggerated in some ways. Apparently, like the Jesse Owens story is apparently false, but still to be actively supplying a black country is quite it's quite unexpected. I never heard.
Yeah, and of course, everyone thinks these days that the Germans and the Japanese were great allies. Only during the war itself, and even then, not really. They didn't cooperate very much between each other.
He had quite a soft spot for the Arabs as well, didn't he?
I think he did a bit, yeah, but that was also to some extent following traditional German foreign policy, which had tried to use the Arabs against the Brits. And particularly, not only the Arabs, the Muslims against the Brits, because obviously Britain ruled so many Islamic countries, or regions, I should say, back then.
Oh, and during this time, obviously, you had to relate it to Winston Churchill, you had a strong Zionist policy in parts of, I think, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Apparently, the Colonial Office had gone really Zionist, and that was beginning to aggravate Palestinian Arabs, especially, the late 30s, It's another factor.
Yeah, but there's a dichotomy there as well, because if you look at a lot of British officers who fought with or led Arab soldiers, you know, I'm thinking about people like Glubb Pasha and these sorts of guys that you'll certainly know, Horus and Ataman, that were very pro-Arab.
I've got to plead ignorance here. I've never heard of the Pasha you said.
Glubb Pasha was a British army officer, and he helped lead the Jordanian Legion at one stage. He also wrote some very good books about nationalism and empire and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, he's
a lot of people on the right.
Book, he's got that essay, Fate of Empires, isn't he? Which is a banger, and it's only 20 pages, so it's worth looking up.
Yeah, he's quite popular on the right these days, shall we say.
Was Glubb Pasha his real name, or was he called like David
Smith? Jonathan Glubb, I think is his real name.
Yeah, he was called Pasha because that's what it was, a traditional hangover from when it was part of the Turkish Empire.
Right.
And it just meant officer, sir, this kind of stuff, you know.
So Which same as that Gordon from Khartoum, actually. He was
he was called Gordon Pasha again because, of course, Egypt originally was part of the Turkish Empire. And there was this quite strong pro-Arabic streak, certainly in the British Army, that continued right up to the 1970s, in fact, you know, because when British soldiers were fighting against the rebels in Oman.
I've read that the Foreign Office, at least until Margaret Thatcher's time, was generally dominated by Arabists. There were some Tory ministers in Thatcher's government, like Ian Gilmore, who was strongly Arabist. I don't know if that meant that they were particularly anti-Israeli or anything. I don't know if maybe it sort of went back further than that. I'm not sure, but yeah, it was still like I think the dominant view in the Foreign Office into the 80s at least, maybe the 90s.
Yeah, well, but like once again, it's coming back to what we were talking about earlier when we were saying about Hitler sending aid to Abyssinia and sending aid to the nationalist Chinese against the Japanese. It's not as simple as a lot of people, including some people on the right, try and pretend. The idea that, you know, the British Empire was this pro-Zionist thing is just not true. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. And it was certainly by no means all the way through pro-Zionist. There were, as you were saying, there were lots of pro-Arabist people also around in the upper echelons of the British elites in those days.
I think it owes a hell of a lot to Arthur Balfour, Winston Churchill, some of the Rothschild politicians, and just like really key, super rich, super influential, well-established people. They managed to sort of drag the wheel in one direction. But I mean, people like Neville Chamberlain weren't up for that stuff at all. I don't think. I don't think it was the dominant view even in the Tory party until until definitely after the Second World War.
Oh, sure. And I mean, as 555 says in the chat, many Zionists today and also in the past were not the biggest fans of the British. I mean, you know, the Zionist Haganah terrorists were killing British soldiers in the 1940s. So, you know, I mean, not just killing them, they were capturing them and then hanging them.
I mean, it's kind of funny actually, because you think like Corbyn in like 2018 was saying one of the worst parts of British history was the Balfour Declaration, even though we weren't actually going to follow through on it, and it was actually sort of terrorist attacks being done on British officers and the such that ended up sort of twisting our arm.
Yeah, Britain was sort of so ready to pull out at that time already, just out of poverty, basically. Yeah, just sort of the empire was just was shriveling, I guess. And those terrorists struck at the right time. They saw that they had the opportunity, and of course, America was ready to press their case at the United Nations, which America was, paying for and hosting and dominated. I think all along the story of Zionism in the 20th century has been of just seizing opportunities and knowing when to strike.
Yeah, and I always remember there's a point you make in one of your videos, actually, Horus, about, is it Emmanuel Shinwell, who was suspected by MI5 of leaking the information about the King David Hotel to those groups.
Wouldn't surprise me. And Richard Ford has actually just brought that up in the chat. Of course, for anyone who doesn't know, the King David Hotel was a hotel which was used by some of the British military in Palestine, as it then was. but it was also used by all their wives and children, and it was also used by a lot of civilians. And the Zionist terrorist Haganah, I think it was, blew it up and killed loads of women and kids.
And loads of Arabs as well. And if the guy supplied information knowing what it was going to be used for, that's treason on a big scale. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. But anyway, we're getting a bit sidetracked here, gents, because we're a long way from.
No, this all relates very well to Winston Churchill.
It does, but I reckon. But I tell you what, it does for us. But if we do a part 4, it will fit in part 4 more than it fits here.
Yeah.
Because we're jumping forward into the late 1940s now. So let's get back into the late 1930s. All right. So Hitler then decided, and look, you may have more to say on this than me, Horus, and so may you, Ataman. Hitler then decided that he was going to take back the Germans in what was this? Was it Sudetenland? I think it was called in Czechoslovakia. Now, to be fair, the Czechs had mistreated the Germans in that part of the world reasonably badly. I mean, they'd killed some, they'd moved quite a lot of people around, and all that sort of stuff. So that they weren't treating the Germans in the Sudetenland particularly well. But Adolf Babes anyway decided that he was going to bring them back into Germany, and the way he was going to do it was to take over the Sudetenland. Horus, how would you go from there, mate?
I'm sorry. This is something I should have read up more on before this stream. I'm not actually sure what precipitated this crisis. I mean, was it? I know that there was a Nazi party among the Sudeten Germans as well, which again had some independence. I can't remember the guy's name. Was it Karl Henlein? I think his name was. He acted alone in some ways. He probably, I would imagine, with some parallels to what the Nazis were behaving like in Austria. Probably, again, took what opportunities he could to stir up, to try and incite Hitler against the Czech government. On the other hand, after the Anschluss, I know that one of the factors that sort of brought Hitler's attention upon this, to the extent that it was, Hitler who caused this, what they call the May crisis, which was just 2 months after the Anschluss, was just that after the Anschluss, once Austria was part of Germany, he described Czechoslovakia, and it was the Czech part of it, really, that was the problem for him, as a dagger sticking into our heart, which on the map, having absorbed Austria, it does look exactly like that. It sticks right into Germany. And another thing that I know that, I think that Hitler feared, basically, was that Edvard Benes, who was the prime minister of Czechoslovakia, was a personal friend of Stalin and was sympathetic to the Soviet Union. He wasn't a communist himself, more sort of a social democrat, although in those days, social democrat was quite left-wing.
Yep.
Obviously, the German Social Democrat Party was a Marxist party. But yeah, like Edvard Benes, I mean, it's hard to I wouldn't criticise him for sticking up for his own nation, but he also did a great deal to intervene in British politics. Apparently,
we've just to explain to the viewers, Czechoslovakia was one of those creations after World War One that had originally been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which Woodrow Wilson decided he wanted to break up, and the British and French went along with that.
Well, this is another thing that Germany benefited from, is that the Slovaks were chafing as much as the Sudeten Germans. And they, again, as soon as we know, Germany obviously took over the Sudetenland. And then by the end of 1938, it was within it was within 6 months of the May crisis, I think. The Slovaks had, I don't know, again, there's so many complicated moving parts to all this, but basically the Slovaks and Germany and Poland, I think, had collectively pressured the remaining Czech government, because I think Benes, who was a very clever figure, stepped down after the May crisis, after the Sudetenland was given away. I think more things were in the hands of the president by then, and that was President Hacha. I don't know, can't remember his first name, but between them, Germany, Slovakia, and Poland put a lot of pressure on Czechoslovakia to kind of dissolve itself in some ways, because Slovakia was calling for independence. understandably, I would say. I mean, they should not have been put under the control of.
Well, they're today they are separate countries, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think they regard themselves as separate nations with different languages and stuff.
To get us back to the 1930s, because otherwise I can see us doing this whole stream and not getting beyond 1939. Basically, the German National Socialists under AH had decided that like they were going to bring home all the Germans in the countries surrounding Germany back into the Reich. Would you say that was a fair summary, Horus?
Yeah, and Hitler was saying, I think, well, at least strongly alluding to wanting to do that even as early as Mein Kampf as well. So, yeah, that was definitely an aim of his from the whole time. He saw it as like, you know, German people being distributed among all these different states. As sort of
so you could
the death of Germany. Right?
So you could kind of say like, you know, you have the remilitarization of the Rhineland, which we talked about in the last episode. Then you had the Anschluss with Austria, which we just briefly looked at. And then Czechoslovakia is the next stage of this. So Germany is expanding.
One other thing just to mention as well was just that Germany and Britain signed a naval agreement, didn't they? I think that was in 1937 or 1936, and that aggravated Mussolini and aggravated France and America as well. I think that.
Yeah, it did, because it basically it was the end of the Washington Naval Treaty, really, because Britain had recognised the German right to have a very small navy. Which the reason Britain did that, by the way, is that the navy Germany was authorised was never going to be able to defeat the Royal Navy. And in fact, in World War II, the German Navy was of minor importance, really, for most of it, apart from the submarine arm.
There's also another element to German-Czech relations. I can't remember. I really should have studied before we did this stream. That there was an incident where the Czechs, I don't know if you guys know about this. The Czechs mobilised some of their forces as though they were going to sort of incur into German.
Mitch, I think it is, has said that Cardamon, rather, I beg your pardon. He's saying here that there had been incidents on the border between Czechoslovakia and Germany ever since 1933. And that is, of course, when the National Socialists became the majority in the governing party in Germany.
So the Czechs did some sort of mobilisation. The Czechs did some clever little manoeuvre. I think the Czechs did this. From what I've read in a book by Igor Lukes, who's an academic in America, he wrote a book about Czechoslovakia, in the 30s, like between Germany and the Soviet Union, basically how they handled those relationships. I think he suggested that Maxim Litvinov, who was the Soviet foreign minister at the time, and he was a clever schemer, provoked, I can't remember where he did it, but something to do with Czech communications. He made sure the Germans would hear it. So that the Germans began to mobilise troops near the Czech border. I think basically by giving Germany the impression that Czechoslovakia was about to incur, which they very likely weren't because they had no real interest in doing that. But that caused a lot of that enabled a lot of sort of intelligence agents who were already against Germany to report to people like Winston Churchill that the Germans were about to invade. I think that must have been before the May crisis.
Mitch is saying it was a partial mobilisation and egged on by the Soviets, which
cleverly provoked by the Soviets. One example of many of how the Soviets were again taking opportunities to cause as much friction as possible between Germany, between France, between Czechoslovakia, between Britain.
Well, let's remember the French had this thing called the Little Entente, which included Czechoslovakia. And basically what it was the French had got involved with all these new nations that were carved out mostly of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that surrounded Germany and tried to make alliances with them, thinking that would help to keep Germany in check. But forgetting that if you divide a country up, it's much less powerful than the sum of its parts. To give you a modern example, if Scotland was independent from Britain and Northern Ireland was independent from Britain and Wales was independent, all four of those nations, including England, would be much weaker than they are together. And the same thing happened with these countries that were hived out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of World War I.
And Scotland would immediately ally with our enemies as well. You know it.
Well, she's certainly not allied with our friends, but I mean, I also believe that the Scots are too wise to go along with that idea.
I specifically mean...
let's not derail this conversation even further. We can do another stream about that. I've got this week's Splendid Isolation stream at the weekend, by the way, is going to be a Northern Ireland special partly. So we're going to be talking about Northern Ireland and what's going on over there, just for people in the chat.
By the way, great respect for the Scots. I meant Sturgeon, really.
Sturgeon and her Scottish Irish immigrant supporters. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So France obviously had the little entente, and they also, I think that was actually, wasn't that like Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia or something? But they also had a treaty. And
Czechoslovakia.
It was Czechs as well, right? So they had like a sort of a mutual defence treaty with Czechoslovakia, but I think it's AJP Taylor again points out that there was no faith behind that. Like they never had any particular plan. They just hoped that would act as a threat towards Germany. They had no intention of actually doing anything. They had no plans
to actually
go and defend Czechoslovakia in any way. Right?
Yeah, well, like when the Czech crisis blew up in 1938, Hitler said he was going to invade the place. The Brits, because they didn't want a war, sensibly enough, under Chamberlain, and the French, because they certainly didn't want a war, as you were just saying there, Horus, both flew over to see Adolf Babes and make sure there wasn't a war. So
yeah, this is where it gets really dirty, and I think like Britain's fault in when it comes to me, I don't know if you wanted to get to Munich exactly yet, but like when I think Britain's fault was really being allied with France. I said this in the first stream we did as well, that like France had this sort of faithless treaty they'd made with the Czechs. They did the same with the Poles as well. They did a weak treaty with the Soviets as well. Like anyone who could be an obstacle to Germany, but to the east, weirdly. They thought they could use all these countries.
Hang on, guys. I just must address this. George Byron in the chat, who is someone I know vaguely from not online, says this chat is more censored than Nazi Germany. Well, there you go, mate. You've not been censored, have you? The only thing I've censored so far on this chat is a bloke who said Mrs. Thatcher should have been a prostitute, and somebody else who was going on and on and on about Israel. That's the only two things I've censored in this chat so far.
Thatcher was decent looking when she was younger, wasn't she? I don't know.
Yeah, when she was younger, she was like average chick, I guess.
They don't mean like Baroness Thatcher in the 2000s, do they?
I'm sure, but I just don't see the point of people going on in the chat. Old Thatcher should have been a street corner walker. I mean, whatever. I don't care. It's got nothing to do with what we're talking about.
Rory Herbert's asking about your avatar, Horus.
Yes, he is. He's saying it's similar to his. Hang on, I'll put it on the screen so you can see it, guys.
All right.
Rory Herbert's saying it's similar to his. And could you explain it, Horus?
I've got loads of Eyes of Horus symbols. I just thought I'd use this one this time.
Yeah, it's an ancient Egyptian type thing, isn't it?
Yeah, not that I'm well informed about it, but I just like it. I just think it looks cool. That's what it is. Many people have asked me why Horus. Just I don't know, just like it. It just looks good.
Fair enough. No problem with that. Ataman, you wanted to talk about how when the British and French intervened over Czechoslovakia, like Czechoslovakia was going to mobilise and had a very heavily fortified border area with Germany, with lots of fortresses and that kind of thing. And for a relatively minor European nation, Czechoslovakia also had a quite large army. And of course, you were pointing out that Patrick Buchanan in the book, which is the basis of this series of streams, pointed out that like by getting rid of that, Britain and France actually did Germany a favour. Do you want to go on about that a little bit, Armin?
Yeah. So I think he actually quotes Uncle A in saying that when they went and actually inspected what was in the Sudetenland, that it was like a rotten floorboard they're about to stand on, and they actually thought, well, they essentially saved. Not only does he point out that from like a military perspective, that he essentially unintentionally saved Germany from making a disastrous military campaign that probably could have really weakened them. But he also points out that when Chamberlain comes and visits and signs the peace and leaves, the German crowds are cheering him through the streets. And there's a point where Hitler says, these people aren't actually ready to be taken to war yet, and he hadn't seen it. And,
sorry,
and just that actually, in a way, I think Neville Chamberlain was just trying to avoid any war on the continent, whether it was one we were in or otherwise. But yeah, he kind of unintentionally saved the Germans in a way.
Look, my own opinion on Neville Chamberlain has changed over the years. I actually think he was mainly trying to stop a war that Britain would get involved in. Like Neville Chamberlain, as the Prime Minister, knew very well that the plans for the expansion of the Royal Navy and all the rest of it. And don't forget, Britain had started slowly expanding her armed forces from the mid-1930s onwards. And in the first place, the Navy, which is obviously should be the most important service to an island nation like Britain, particularly back then when we still had an empire. And Neville Chamberlain, as the British Prime Minister, knew very well that the Royal Navy plan was based on a war that started in 1942. It wasn't based on a war that would start in 1938 or 1939. Wouldn't be ready, and because of the stuff that would happen if a war started, it would never be ready if that happened, if you see what I mean. Like the Royal Navy would have been probably at least 30% stronger in 1942 than she was in 1939. So I think Chamberlain was doing a sensible thing. It was also true that in 1937 and 1938, the British public didn't want a war. They weren't interested. There were far too many veterans and widows from World War I still around.
Well, did anyone want a war at that point? I mean, any of the populaces, because even the Americans, I think I saw actually quite recently someone showed polling data from the time.
The American public wanted to keep out of European problems, which was quite sensible.
The Germans didn't want a war. The French didn't want a war. Basically, no one wanted to do this.
I think the American people were bitter about having been drawn into the First World War. They were really pissed off about it, even as
I'd never worked that out because they didn't lose that many people in World War I, but because they were not in it for very long.
No.
So,
but I think they just they actually seem to have valued the fact that they had established this new world sort of thing, and that, but their politicians basically were getting them re-embroiled in the old world, which you could imagine maybe half a century later could lead to them being invaded or something. I don't know what they feared exactly.
Well, I know many Americans on the dissident right today will point to FDR as being like the real tipping point in America.
Yeah.
For like America going bad. I mean.
Yeah. I think.
And there wasn't any opposition because Huey Long, who probably would have been against the war, was taken out.
Charles Lindbergh tried his best. Henry Ford tried, I think, but Henry Ford had already been broken by the time because he was told that all your advertising is going to stop.
Didn't Henry Ford have a newspaper that was for a while the most read newspaper in the northeast? Yeah,
the Dearborn Independent.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was where his main plant was, Dearborn, Michigan, I think. And he used his wealth to make himself a major sort of publishing magnate. But he picked the wrong people to tussle with in the 30s. Yeah,
and of course, I'm pretty sure Huey Long was shot by a Jew. Just saying.
I've got guys. The YouTube is not a free speech platform.
I know. We're skirting around it. We're not.
Well, to return to Munich, I see Richard Ford here has said Chamberlain was a good man. I think so. He certainly operated in good intentions. Didn't always have good judgment. I mean, when he was about to go to Munich, he said this thing about a country far away that we know nothing of. That pissed a lot of people off. And obviously, when he came back, he said he'd secured peace for our time. But
hugely popular,
which was massively popular, like celebrated. Yeah. People
go and watch some of the videos on YouTube, which you can still find, where he arrived back at Croydon Airport, which was London Airport back in those days, and the enormous crowds who are so happy that he secured this peace at Munich.
I mean, like the fact, so like this is something that really does still get talked about today. I think absolutely right to secure peace, but I can well understand why the Munich settlement was treated as this rather disgusting and embarrassing, or has been treated since this. I think it's the one of the few things that the sort of anti-German people who are the prevailing view now were right about, that the Czechoslovakia was betrayed by its ally, like by France.
This is
true that they were betrayed. Like
this is what I'm trying to get Ataman to talk about, because he was talking to me about this just before we started. Basically, the main Czech defense zone was removed by their allies.
Yeah, they basically disarmed them in a way.
This was stuff that the German general staff, when they came to look at it later, when they occupied the Sudetenland, they said, "By God, it was a good job we didn't have to attack this stuff."
Yeah, I think one of them even described it as a second Maginot Line.
Yeah, it was very strong, and of course the Germans themselves. Sorry, I'll just say this: the Germans themselves. One thing that the Anschluss in Austria had made plain to the German military was that there were mistakes in their mobilization and the way they were going to move. And this stuff, although there was no fighting in the Anschluss, like they were greeted with flowers in most places by the Austrians, this betrayed to the Germans that, hang on, our army still ain't quite ready for this. And like I say, when they actually went to look at the Sudetenland in what had been Czechoslovakia, they actually turned around and said, "It's a good job we didn't have to attack this."
It would have been, for them, a very serious, costly war. It could have gone on for quite a long time. It was like steep mountains, I think, largely. The Sudetenland was like steep mountains, brilliant defensive positions that you would have had to like absolutely pound from the air and stuff. Obviously, the Czechs had an air force as well. They had the Skoda works, so they could like replenish their vehicle production. There was talks, serious talks, and I think Churchill encouraged this, between the Soviets and the Czechs about, the Soviets were totally prepared to send armed forces to help them, but that meant travelling through Poland or Romania, and neither of those would agree to that. And the Soviets were not
understandably enough.
Well, yeah. I mean, they would have never got their freedom back. I mean, they would have been screwed. They would have been eaten. Almost certainly, I think.
I mean, let's be clear about this. In 1938, Hitler was a mere amateur in terms of mass murder compared to Stalin. Like, Stalin had already murdered millions of people in 1938, whereas Hitler wasn't even in the hundreds of thousands at this stage.
Anyone who says that this was any sort of humanitarian war is just plain wrong. It just was not.
Literally siding with the Soviets.
Yeah, and that largely...
which is what everyone says the British and French should have done in 1939. But, actually, of course, the opposite happened, and Stalin and Hitler became basically allies in 1939.
Which was unexpected to everyone else, wasn't it? I mean, all through 1939, Chamberlain was under severe pressure. We're jumping ahead a little bit here, but because I think we should talk a little bit more about the Czech situation. But Hitler and Chamberlain in 1939 came under severe pressure to make an alliance with the Soviets, and his way of dealing with it, because presumably this was a lot of this was after Kristallnacht, which obviously had swung public opinion somewhat. But a lot of the Tories by this point were becoming effectively pro-Soviet, which is just repulsive to me. But his response was just to send deliberately incapable diplomats to the Soviets to conduct the negotiations, and just give them no remit. Just say anything they ask for, you've got to ring me. And then when he was called up, it's I'm not available. So he stalled for time for months all the way through 1939. But that is jumping ahead.
Sorry, Horus. Give us your final thoughts on what went on at Czechoslovakia and Munich.
Well, I mean, it was who rightfully controlled the Sudetenland was it's sort of both and neither. I mean, it was fair enough that it was it had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not the German, right? The Sudetenland specifically had.
So you could argue, I suppose, that like not getting rid of the Austro-Hungarian Empire might have been a good idea. Because I know quite a lot of people on the right who would argue that today, and I'm kind of fall in that camp.
A lot of people on the sort of nationalist, traditionalist, reactionary right, as well as a lot of libertarians. It's been supported by a lot of different right-wing forces, like getting rid of the Austro-Hungarians.
A lot of people were what I call the real right. Yes.
Yeah. The Austro-Hungarian Empire wasn't above fault either, was it? I mean, the way they dealt with the Serbs, the way they dealt with a lot of other countries in the Balkans was really rough. They treated the Serbs. But they
weren't particularly like vicious. They didn't kill enormous numbers of their own people.
No.
And getting rid of them after World War One, to me, I never saw a sense of it from a European point of view. But
No, that was an American project. I'm sure that was. And it was, that ties into what we're talking about, because it was also called for, especially by the Masaryk family, Thomas and Jan Masaryk, who were, by the time of the Czech crisis, Jan Masaryk was operating in London and bribing British politicians and British civil servants, including Winston Churchill. This is a major fact. I mean, are we relating this still to Winston Churchill? This is sort of how we started the series, wasn't it?
Well, look, the whole of this series is really based on what Britain did, rather than what Germany or everybody else was doing. But it's to me, it's like the mistakes that, to me, because I'm not a big Churchill fan, and I think he made Britain's position much worse than it needed been. This is why I started doing this in the first place.
Well, yeah, I've been reading David Irving's book, Churchill's War, which is a very, very good read, if nothing else. I mean, you could do a whole stream just debating David Irving's Irv. But I think it shows that loads of British politicians and civil servants were in the pay of Czechoslovakia. This is quite apart from the focus. The focus only became sort of big factor probably in 1938. It existed before.
I think it started in 36 and it became quite a big deal in 37, something like that.
Right, and the Czech crisis drew loads of new people into it, including Harold Macmillan, who obviously became Prime Minister later. But we talked about the focus a fair bit last time, didn't we? This bribery on the part of the Czech government was a major factor as well. They bought off people like Ralph Wigram and Rex Leeper, who were like key civil servants at the Foreign Office. They were helping Winston Churchill make all these like ridiculous prognostications about how powerful the Luftwaffe was and all this stuff. So they were a factor. I feel like quite strongly against these people like Masaryk and Benes. I think they were pretty scoundrels in how they behaved. Like they put their country before the general peace of Europe, which I think is pretty bad. But I would say that Hitler, I mean, he was a bully. There's no doubt about that. I mean, sure. When he saw an opportunity to get what he wanted, force was always on the table. Usually the threat of force. He often threatened without actually being able to sustain things, like what we said about the remilitarization of the Rhineland. He wasn't ready to actually defend it. In the case of the Anschluss, he just sent in like sort of scrapped together forces who were just put together at the last minute.
And you could argue, Horus, that people like Churchill and the focus group, which is quite infamous these days, rightly so in my opinion.
Rightly, yeah.
They actually made things worse because they exaggerated the size of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and all this kind of stuff. They made people more worried about standing up to him when Hitler was doing this bullying because they exaggerated the size of his forces.
Right. And helped create this atmosphere of hysteria. So when Chamberlain flew off to Munich, there was literally like AA guns being put out in Hyde Park. Apparently, there was sandbags, trenches, evacuation of children, and all this stuff. So
all stuff that would happen again for real in 1939, of course. But can I just say to Lucky in the chat, Hitler mass murdered people. I don't think that ever happened. Mate, I don't know what the other guests on this stream will say, but for myself, I know Hitler did mass murder people, but he only did so from 1941 onwards, really.
Never happened.
Mass murdered people.
photos where it didn't happen. Pictures of wooden doors do not count.
Adamant, hang on. This is me speaking for myself, and I'll give you an opportunity to speak for yourself in a minute. But for myself, he was a mass murderer, but not until after June 1941, really, and actually a bit later than that. From June 1941, really, to be fair. But I also think that, you know, the 6 guerrillion figure that gets thrown about is probably a bit exaggerated. A bit, not totally.
As you said, YouTube's not a free speech platform.
Exactly. But that's my own view on it. Yeah, Hitler was a mass murderer. I don't like Hitler. Don't get me wrong, guys. I am no fan of Hitler whatsoever. I'm a Anglo-Celtic patriot. I'm a Brit. I'm an Englishman. I'm not a fan of Hitler. Trust me, I'm not. But I also am ready to recognise that Stalin was at least as bad.
I think one of the I think obviously the German regime, not just Hitler. I mean, some of the Wehrmacht as well. They would have committed crimes against civilians, but like I think also you should always, when talking about German crimes, remember the role of war propaganda, and we're not just talking about from Britain and America, who had a track record of the New York Times flagrantly lied about certain things, but also the Soviet war propaganda. I mean, it's anything from true to completely ridiculous, and generally towards the ridiculous end. And it was from them, and it was in their conquest zone that all the worst crimes are supposed to have happened. I would say that. Apart from that, like there's no exonerating Germany for the crimes they did commit. So the extent of it is that's for a whole nother series of streams. I mean, like you could go into so much detail there.
And also the German army traditionally, even going back to 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, had always treated civilians who fought against them very harshly. That was a German tradition.
Yeah, I would say look at the way that Germany treated the countries that it conquered. Apparently, Estonia lost... Sorry, Germany, did I say Germany? I meant the Soviets. Apparently, Estonia lost something like a third of its population under Soviet occupation. That's just from 1940 to 45, I think.
Well, I mean, just look at how many Soviets that Stalin killed.
When Germany and the Soviets carved up Poland in 1939, apparently just trucks full of Poles started, train loads of Poles started rolling eastward, like never to be seen again. So it was just a standard thing when the Soviets took over anywhere. They just enslaved whoever they wanted and kill whoever they thought would be a threat, which was a lot of people. So, I mean, yeah, when it comes to war crimes, you've got to consider that everything, well, not everything, but a lot of what's attributed to Germany in the East may be Soviet crimes, may be explanations for what Soviets did.
I think everyone in the East committed war crimes, like everyone.
Yeah. And there's also just partisan activity. A lot of the people supposedly murdered might have been partisans. Well, a lot of them definitely were. Anyway, I think we should return to 1938. I think
so do I. I'm getting distracted by the chat. So anyway, last thoughts on the Czechoslovakia situation in Munich, Horus, and then I'll ask Ataman for the same.
Well, I'll add one thing that later in the year, a few months after Germany had obviously acquired the Sudetenland by a mixture of bullying and sort of Czechoslovakia foolishly relying on France and thereby Britain, who were not going to go to the lengths they wanted to save them. A few months afterwards, President Hacha was invited, but sort of ordered to come to Germany. He literally had like a heart attack during the meeting, and Hitler and I think Goering just sort of stayed there and waited for him to come back to consciousness or something.
Yeah, they browbeat the shit out of him as far as I understand,
forced him to yield Bohemia and Moravia, what we now call Czechia, to become a German protectorate. I mean, that is an example of German diplomacy probably at its worst, I think.
Yeah,
it's nastiest.
Not sure you could even call that diplomacy, but yeah.
In the Clausewitzian broad sense, yeah.
Look, I mean, again, looking at it from the point of view of this stream, which is looking at it from an Anglo angle, did it really matter to Britain what happened to Czechoslovakia? No. Britain was never allied with Czechoslovakia.
I think Britain should not have been involved because they should not have been allied with France. Like, France can make their silly alliances that they never intend to keep if they want, but Britain should not have been trying to stand by anything France had promised.
Yeah, this is the point I would try to get across to people watching this in the chat. The idea of these streams is not to talk about morals. It's not to talk about what was best for Europe. It's to talk about what was best for Britain. And this is the whole point of Patrick Buchanan's book about the unnecessary war and how Britain lost its empire and the West lost the world. That's the whole point of the book. It's got nothing to do with morals, really. It's about realpolitik and what you should and shouldn't do and what you can and cannot do. Yeah, so look, I'm not saying that what Germany did with Czechoslovakia was moral and good. I don't care what was moral and good. I'm a realpolitik guy. I agree with what you can enforce. The only things that are real in terms of international law is what a country can enforce. It is strong enough militarily at the end of the day to enforce. All the rest of it is bullshit.
Ergo, the current political issues.
Yeah, I mean, look, we can look at that, and look, we speak about this quite often, Adam, as you know, on our streams on Saturday evenings UK time. And yeah, absolutely, it's like I believe international law to me is crap. International law is what you can enforce.
Yeah, well, I studied international relations at uni as one of my courses, and one of the first things they taught us was like, well, under a nation state, I mean, there's laws, and to varying extents through time and space, like they are abided to, and you have this notion of the rule of law. But in international affairs, it is anarchy. The League of Nations didn't change that. The League of Nations was just a sort of an attempt to make a lot of people act together, a lot of countries act together. But I mean, yeah, in international matters, it is anarchy. And it is just power that matters most. Like you can make morality a factor in your calculations if you want, but you can't in any way force others to do so.
Look, Horus. If it turns out that it was the American Navy that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline,
which it fucking was.
Well, I'd put money it was either them or the Brits being told by the Americans to do it, because both navies could do it very easily. But absolutely, the Americans would have been behind it. But even if that was proven, what is anyone going to do to America in Europe? Nothing. Not a damn thing.
If I was Britain now, I mean, obviously this is far from reality, but I would probably tell them to remove their embassy from London, which is massive.
That ain't gonna happen because
boot them out.
Yeah, but even if you did that, what would you use for the British Armed Forces for many of their weapons?
Mate, I haven't thought it through at all. I'm just really
exactly.
Really
You couldn't do it. You couldn't do it.
I'm fucking angry with them.
I think it's also very important for people on the right in Britain to realise that many of the ordinary people in the United States are good people. It's not the people that we're talking about. It's the Biden regime and whoever the hell controls the senile old scumbag.
Is Academic Agent listening to this? Because I hope so. Because this relates.
He's streaming himself, I believe.
Of course, yeah.
But conveniently, if he ever catches this, he is. I get quite bored with this Brits good, American bad thing when you're talking about ordinary people rather than governments.
I wrote a post on Telegram yesterday saying that what America did was an act of war, but I very carefully worded it to say Biden's government did this, and that the governments of Europe, including Britain, that are not reacting against this act of war, as I see it, it shows that they're servants of the US oligarchy, not of the US people. That's a completely different matter.
Oh, look, there was a very good video put out yesterday, I think, by an American ex-soldier dude, who was pointing out why they can't recruit for the American military anymore. And one of his points, and he made about 7, which were all good, and you can see it on my Discord, by the way, gents, because I put it in there, is that a lot of Americans don't want to join the American military because they think eventually they're going to have to fight the real people of America.
I was just looking at this comment on the screen from Mitch. 300,000 Poles and Ukrainians I can't remember what IIRC means.
If I remember correctly.
If I remember, were gulagged after the Soviets took chunks from Lvov to Brest-Litovsk. Is that when Germany and
when they carved up Poland between them? Yes.
Right. See, yeah, that's what I was referring to, and that's related in several books. That, yeah, I mean, the German and Soviet governments sort of both profited from that, I think, and got along quite well in some ways. But
they were until Barbarossa, they were allies, basically.
Yeah. Until the moment they suddenly weren't. but Poland's suffering began. Well, Poland's one of Poland's many spells of suffering began the day the Soviets took over, the eastern half of their country, and it's absolutely savage. Yeah, it's appalling.
All right, Ataman, final thoughts on Czechoslovakia and Munich?
I'll be honest, I actually really don't know enough about Munich. All I remember particularly is that quote from Uncle A, where he says that if he sees Chamberlain again, he's going to snap his umbrella and kick him down the stairs, which seems a bit harsh.
This is something.
Yeah, he was a bit crude sometimes. Was AD? AH.
He seems to have regarded Chamberlain with contempt, didn't he?
Which I think was actually wrong, because Chamberlain was originally always was trying to defend the British position, which was no war before 1942.
Yeah, and I would just, before we move on from this, I'll just have one more thing. Was that Hitler, after bizarrely, after gaining the Sudetenland, was really angry because the Western press, and we might want to put brackets around that, I don't know, but the Western press seem to have gloated. They seem to have set up a story where he was trying to take the whole of Czechia at that time in the May crisis. Obviously, he did gain it later in the year, but at a diplomatic cost. But they portrayed it as though he was trying to get it all, and he had to settle for only the Sudetenland. And obviously, they could draw on the map, just these little strips along the border. It's that's all he got for all his trouble. So they actually gloated over it as a loss for Hitler, and that seems to have infuriated him. I'm not sure I can explain exactly why, but that really, and that's what spurred him on to then go after the whole rest of the west of Czechoslovakia. So that this goading in the press was a factor as well, which as I say, I mean the focus and similar types probably had quite a lot to do with that. But yeah, maybe we can move on from the Czech stuff now.
Okay, well, look, from the British point of view, let's point out that in 1938, the main fire aircraft defending Britain was the biplane Gloucester Gladiator, which actually fought until 1942 in World War II anyway. Hurricanes, there were a few squadrons of Hurricanes in RAF Fire Command. The Spitfire wasn't even in operational service yet. And as I repeatedly said, the Royal Navy was trying to get ready for a war in 1942, which was what Britain could afford to do without going bankrupt. But none of this worked out. You had Munich, as Horus and Ataman have said. Chamberlain came home waving his piece of paper, peace in our time, and Hitler had no intention really of sticking with that. Now let's move on to Poland. Poland, originally, the AH plan was to make an alliance with Poland because Poland was desperately anti-Soviet, as indeed Poland is still desperately anti-Russian. Understandably, in some respects, if you're a Pole. But the original German idea was to make an alliance with Poland, which didn't work out. Now, what's your views on that, chaps?
Do you want to go first, Alan?
Yeah, it's not really my expertise, but I mean there's a lot of stuff about what was it? What was the name of the radio tower that they that the whole sort of that the first sort of attack was sort of framed around?
That was probably almost certainly actually a German con, but this is rather later than what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the time around what was going on at Munich in 1938 and in 1937. That was when Germany would have preferred an alliance with Poland that was an anti-Soviet alliance.
Yeah, like an anti-Comintern pact or something.
Exactly.
But I mean, the thing is, like, again, like, there's something to be said about like the regime in Poland at the time.
Well, yes, there is, which was a military dictatorship. The House, remember?
Who had, sort of, let's say, camps of their own. They weren't, they had their own issues with certain groups, and
they did. Yes, there were certain groups today who would not be very popular with the Polish military dictatorship in the 1930s. That's entirely true.
Yeah, and they were. I mean, they were very, very basically quite fascistic themselves. So the idea that sort of us signing the treaty to defend them from the Germans, but not the Soviet Union, which is of course just a coincidence. It's obviously kind of laughable when we now frame this as this sort of battle for democracy or freedom or something.
Battle for democracy and freedom and non-racism and all the other bullshit that is talked about World War II. Yeah,
I mean the Polish were for the French just a minor ally to try and replace what had been left by them losing Russia as a major ally.
Absolutely correct.
Yeah, and. Yeah, I mean the whole Poland situation is just a complete mess. I mean, I have some sympathy for them, but still.
Look, I have some sympathy for them, except that really their sensible deal would have been to have made an alliance with Germany.
Do you think if they'd actually handed over those contentious territories, do you think Germany would have let it be?
I think if there had been a German-Polish alliance, and Poland had given up Gdansk and allowed a corridor to it from Germany, maybe. I think that's the most you can probably say. Maybe, but it certainly wouldn't have been as disastrous as it was for them with what they did, because what Britain did and then France followed along. Let's be honest, don't blame France for this. France just followed Britain, giving basically what Chamberlain did, because he was so annoyed at Hitler for still expanding after Munich, that he basically gave the big red British war button to Poland. Which no government leader should ever give to another country, ever, for any reason.
Yeah.
You don't give another government your war button. You keep it for yourself.
I think,
and that to me is common sense.
This is one of the parts of British policy that Buchanan focuses on very strongly and from many different angles in his book, doesn't it? I mean, he spends seriously several chapters really on British-Polish relations in 1939, and what a disastrous decision it was to guarantee them only against Germany as well. I mean, that was a secret clause. I don't think that was announced, but it was only a guarantee against Germany. So obviously, when Germany did declare war on Poland in early September, the Soviets did what was it 18 or 19 days later, and Britain only declared war on Germany, which was it's unbelievable. I mean, Chamberlain, it's so hard to understand how Chamberlain came to that position, because he didn't want to do that.
He was annoyed, I think, Horus. I think he was just annoyed that Hitler had fooled him.
Well, in the same way. Well, not in the same way, but with some parallels to Hitler was annoyed with Chamberlain because he believed that he denied him a much bigger gain than just the Sudetenland. But although Hitler then got what he wanted a few months later anyway, then Chamberlain has this spat at Hitler for basically making him look like a fool. I mean, again, Chamberlain shouldn't have handed him his balls by saying, this is I've secured peace. You haven't. You've secured peace by someone who's not happy with it. And obviously, you've only addressed relations between two countries, and Germany's got problems with several.
Totally right. And can I just say to people in the chat, I just blocked MV because MV said I hate Britain. That's enough to give you blocks on this channel. See ya.
It's like a reverse AA. ZZ maybe.
No, I'm sorry. I make no bones about it. I'm an Anglo-Celtic patriot. That's why I decided to do this series of streams. And if you hate Britain, I don't want you on my channel. See ya.
Damn right. Damn right. I think one interesting thing about how Britain came to make its guarantee of Polish safety, again with the hushed bit being only against Germany, was that happened in March. I think it was the start of March.
Horus, the thing was, there was no way that Britain and France between them were capable of helping Poland in any way, shape, or form anyway.
Yep, and never did anything. Obviously, all that you could say Britain and France did for Poland, well, just Britain really did for Poland, was allowed some of the Polish forces to fight as part of the British forces in the war. I mean,
yeah, for sure. And to be fair, they fought bravely and well.
And then they saw their country handed over to Stalin anyway.
Yep, exactly right.
Yeah, but yeah, so Britain gave its guarantee in, I think it was the 2nd of March, very early March, 39. But it was, I mean, Chamberlain seems to have been prompted to do so out of exasperation, but really, like, the trigger was this report from a journalist called Ian Colvin, who I see his name mentioned a few other times in the 30s and 40s. And I wonder, I've not seen any evidence, this is pure speculation, but I wonder, right, he was given some senior Romanian politician told Colvin to tell the British government that Romania was under threat, was about to be invaded by Germany or something. I think that's what it was. And Halifax had by this time turned against appeasement, it seems. He was, he's often named as one of the key appeasers, and people say, oh, it's good that he didn't become prime minister after Chamberlain because he was an appeaser, all this stuff. But he had given up on appeasement by this point. And it appears like was Chamberlain's most trusted guy in the cabinet. And he appears to have helped pressure Chamberlain to, at this point, basically abandon appeasement. And it was this incident that was the trigger, that Colvin coming to them with this report that was bullshit. It was complete bullshit. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say one thing, that what I think a lot of modern people, young people especially, don't understand is that when you're looking at Britain in 1938 and 1939, Britain in 1938 and 1939 was much more like America today than Britain is today. Like, Britain had just about the largest navy in the world. The American Navy was almost as big as the Royal Navy, but not quite. Our army was quite small, but then Britain didn't particularly, although nowhere near as small as it is today, but Britain didn't really particularly need an enormous army while she had such a big navy. And the RAF was one of the most advanced air forces in the world. So when you're looking at this stuff, if you're a young bloke in his 20s or something, you have to understand that in 1939 and 1938, Britain was much more in the position of America today than Britain today.
It's sort of some way towards a global hegemony.
Yeah, not totally, but 50-50. It was Britain. It was really the British Empire and America that ran most of the world in those days. And the British Empire had much the biggest population and much the most territory, shall we say.
I think Britain was severely wounded by the First World War and the death.
Oh yeah, it was, but not as much as people pretend today. Britain was paying off her World War I debts quite easily, even in the 1920s during the Great Depression. Britain was paying off her World War I debts fairly easily, and by about 1937, Britain was coming out of the Great Depression and doing quite well. I mean, to give you an example of this, if you're a British guy, go around some of those lovely 1930s built suburban houses, which are so popular in Britain today because they're so nice. That were actually built in 1936, 1937, 1938, and even the early part of 1939.
Is that what we call Edwardian houses, or?
No. Edwardian is up to about 1911. Right. I'm talking about pre-war 1930s houses. You know, the very nice semis you find in a lot of British suburbs and this kind of stuff, right. With reasonably big gardens and like probably 2 or 3 bedrooms, this kind of stuff.
The other factor in Chamberlain, obviously, being pressured, basically, I think it was almost all down to pressure. He didn't really want to do what he did in March. But the other factor, of course, was that after Czechia had been absorbed as this German protectorate, but basically under German control, there was Kristallnacht in, I think, November 1938, and it's not just what was perceived as, this was nothing to do with Versailles. This was a crime against civilians, and it's very, the press absolutely made the most of it, and kind of understandably. I mean, it's suddenly, this is people being murdered, people having their religious buildings being burnt down and stuff. That really made Germany look bad across Britain, across America,
for sure,
and that really helped begin to stoke up the sort of war hysteria against them. As we said earlier, like, Chamberlain was cheered when he returned from Munich. Obviously, that didn't look so good after Munich didn't. Well, Munich didn't lead to war, but it did lead to Czechia being absorbed into the German sort of dominion. But again, I think that, people were still up for peace, but Kristallnacht made it look like, we're at peace with a really grubby regime here. So that really, it's not fair, because the amount of people who were killed or murdered or whatever, manslaughtered on Kristallnacht is probably about 3 hours killing in Stalin's Soviet Union, right? So it's nothing compared to Stalin's crimes. But there you go. The media was looking for, I think, the media and the Focus were looking for things, and they had a lot of sway with the media. One of them was Henry Wickham Steed, who was previously editor of the Times. People like that. Churchill had a lot of media contacts, and so on and so on. Beaverbrook was a good friend of Churchill.
Sure. And
you had Ivan Maysky, the Soviet. This is something I'd recommend everyone read if they've got the time. Read the Maysky diaries. It's stunning how successful the Soviet ambassador was in cultivating contact among Britain. He had David Lloyd George talking to him. He had Lord Beaverbrook talking to him. He had Randolph Churchill. He had Winston Churchill. And above all, he had Robert Van Sittert, who, until Chamberlain demoted him in, I believe, early 1939, he was head of the Foreign Office, civil servant head of the Foreign Office. And he was just openly and blatantly and aggressively anti-German. And he was scheming with everybody. I think he was probably one of the people. Well, no one's accused of this, I suspect. No, actually, no, I don't. He was anti-German from way earlier, right? As a younger man, he'd gone on a cycling trip all around Europe, and he just said he hated Germans. He just found them brusque and competitive and rude and whatever. And he just had this sort of basically like national racial hatred of Germany. From way earlier in his life. So he probably wasn't being bribed. There was probably no need to bribe him. He was directly scheming with the Soviet ambassador. It's disgraceful. Treasonous.
Listen, Horus, I sometimes hear this from people on the right, that many British elites had this fanatical mad dog anti-Germanism. And I'm not saying it's not true, because I wasn't.
Others.
Yeah, no. Look, I'm not arguing with you. All I am saying is, from my point of view, I'm not saying it's not true. Maybe it was, but even if you were, like, if you want to preserve the British Empire, which from my point of view would be what I was trying to do, well, why would you get us in a war we can't win?
I mean, like, the same goes for Hitler, doesn't it? Like why did Hitler not appreciate Chamberlain? Chamberlain was the best friend he could have expected, right? You don't like Stanley Baldwin, I know less about, but I mean, Stanley Baldwin is probably a man who Hitler could have done business with, but he was finished by then. But you don't want Churchill taking over. If you're Hitler, you don't want Churchill taking over. You don't want anyone like that, right?
Absolutely correct.
You don't want people like Leo Amory or whatever. So you have to handle Britain carefully, and he, Hitler's way of handling Britain. I mean, he sent, as we said last week, he sent von Ribbentrop as his emissary to Britain.
Yeah, who was not popular. Not popular.
Right. And we've all got reason to regret that because, I'll speak for myself anyway. I would rather this war had never happened. Even if that does mean Hitler remaining in place, even if that does mean some crimes against civilians, like the war was worse than whatever Hitler did domestically, as far as I'm
concerned. I think it would have been very difficult for Britain not to get dragged into a war eventually. My only thing is Britain shouldn't have got dragged into the war until at least 1942. When everything in Britain would have been much stronger, like the Navy, the Army and the Air Force would all have been much stronger. The British economy would have been much stronger. And if you're going to get into a war, okay, get dragged into it in 1942 if you must. Like, in other words, do what America did in World War I and World War II. Don't join until it suits you.
Yeah, and let's So I take the point about what you said about the armaments were sort of peaking and the financial situation for Britain was most fortuitous in, as you say, 42, right? Let's say that just fate decided that we had to have a war with Germany. Could it not least have been then? And could it? I mean, Germany would have been stronger as well, we assume. I don't know, but could it?
I don't think it would have been, to be honest.
Well, maybe not. Right.
I think Germany in 42 would have been in almost exactly the same position as she was in 42 anyway.
Right, and they had major financial problems. I mean, their inflation may have overcome them by then. I mean, they may have been a collapsing country.
But they still would have been involved in this enormous war to the death with the Soviets.
Presumably,
right? Yeah. Almost certainly they would have been involved in that. They might have had Poland as an ally rather than an enemy, but that's the only difference they might.
That would have helped. Yeah, that would have been
good. Well, it would have given Germany some more manpower for sure, but and who knows what America would have done under those circumstances? We can't tell. I mean, the Japanese might have bombed the shit out of Pearl Harbor, and there might have been a totally separate war between the Americans and the Japanese. We just don't know.
But or just to finish my sentence from before, just if only it could have been a moderate in charge of Britain, someone like Halifax. Yeah, I mean, Chamberlain died soon after he left office.
Yes, he was a sick man, which might have even had something to do with that rubbish to Poland. But who knows?
I mean, I wish Chamberlain had lived long enough to write his memoirs, at least, to write an autobiography, because then we would have had his side of it. We never had Chamberlain's side of the story in his own words. All there is in all the history books is just letters to his sister. He seemed to be very, very, very. What's the word like? Open with his sister. I can't remember.
They were friends. Yes, absolutely.
And he would talk about his diplomatic decisions and stuff. But if only assuming he was going to die, if only it could have been someone like Halifax who was moderate, who was sensible, who did care about the financial situation of Britain.
Horace, the sensible thing for Britain to do in 1937, 1938, 1939 was to try and keep the peace whilst building up her armed forces at a rate she could sustain without ruining her economy. That was the most sensible thing to do, and anyone except Winston Churchill would have done that.
Yeah, and Churchill. I mean, I've read so much about and by Churchill, and there's just no mention of finance. He just did not care about the debt situation. It's just, I mean, in accordance with how he lived his life and how his father lived as well, and his mother, just profligate wastrels. Basically, they just did not think about the long term, and that I believe is why there's this long string of characters through not just the 1930s, but his whole life, but especially in the 30s, of people just paying Churchill to do their bidding. There's a list of people. I discussed him in one of my
Churchill
videos.
Churchill was almost always desperate for money because he always lived beyond his means.
Just drinking the finest brandies and whiskies, and no matter how in debt he was, just carrying on living the highest life he could. Living Chartwell with 30 staff. It's ridiculous.
Well, it's okay if that's what you do, but like Churchill just didn't care. He lived very high. I mean, you should see some of the shitty American magazines and newspapers he wrote for in the 1930s, and the crap he wrote about. You'd be quite surprised.
Irving goes into that. Irving's got a very sort of dry, sardonic style, and he talks about like Churchill was just a writer for hire. They would just ask him to read this book and review it, books that he didn't know about, and it's just I think of him as generally, I mean, it's a bit rude, but a rent boy. I think.
All right. We've not got very far in this stream really in terms of history. I just want to answer Cardam in the chat. He's saying the Germans might have had Graf Zeppelin by 1942, which, for anyone who doesn't know, was the one and only German aircraft carrier that was never finished. Well, even if they had, the Royal Navy by 1942 would have had about 15 aircraft carriers, and I don't think Graf Zeppelin would have lasted very long, to be honest. So that's my answer to that one. And also, before I ask Ataman to have a few words, Ron Muller says, wasn't Halifax a Nazi sympathizer? No, he wasn't. He was he was not desperate for war with Germany, but he wasn't a Nazi sympathizer. That's not fair at all.
I think he's been maybe portrayed that way since, but it's
well, yeah, of course he has, because everyone tries to big up Churchill.
He was really Christian. Halifax was like really super religious.
Churchill made him ambassador to the USA, didn't he? I think. Not pretty sure.
Yeah, I think so.
During World War II. Halifax was a pretty good bloke on the whole. But
wasn't that just a means of keeping Halifax out of the way, though?
Yeah, it was. It was Ataman. Absolutely, it was. That's why he sent him there. But the point I'm trying to make was he wasn't a Nazi sympathizer.
No. Which is why Churchill didn't want him around, I suppose. Well,
yeah, absolutely correct. Because Churchill was determined to fight World War II, kill Britain and kill the British Empire as it might. Because Churchill really did not give a shit about the British Empire that he claimed to love. Because had he have done, he wouldn't have fought World War II the way he did.
It's such a tawdry sort of lowbrow kind of person to come in and rule perhaps the most powerful country in the world. It's so, like, I mean, to say that he had blind spots is to be too kind. Like, there was just whole areas of life that he just didn't have his sort of childish attention wouldn't go. I mean, it's amazing because he had talents as well. I mean, he had a way with.
Oh, look, he was a very intelligent man. He wrote great English.
But he's intelligent only in certain ways, but in others he had no mind for certain things. I mean you've said
he was absolutely useless as a naval and military strategist. He was entirely useless. He killed more British sailors and soldiers than the Germans did.
And I mean, there's a quote from him from I think 1944 or 45 where he says, apparently with a straight face, that Britain will come out of this war more powerful than ever before. What? Like, what? How? How can that happen?
When the Americans sent a cruiser to Cape Town in 1942 to take the very, very, very last of the British gold reserves away back to America, how was Britain coming out of that war more powerful?
That's so symbolic, that moment. It's like literally the treasure of the British Empire just shipping across the Atlantic.
Well, I mean, long before that, before Lend-Lease was enacted, the reason Lend-Lease was enacted was only after every single British asset and company in America was sold to American owners for knockdown prices.
And at each of these stages, as he realised the price that they extracted for Lend-Lease, the price they extracted for the Dreadnought deal, was it Dreadnought or Destroyer deal? Destroyers. Sorry, yeah. Destroyer deal for the shipping of gold across, and like what he had to give for all these things. And there's various moments like in his memoirs where he said like how appallingly the Americans were squeezing him. And this was early. This was before America joined the war. And like at all these stages, he could have just said, well, actually, is this really worth the price? I mean, could we not come to some sort of agreement with Germany?
Well, look, I don't think Britain even needed to come to some stage of an agreement with Germany. Britain just didn't have to do what Churchill wanted her to do. Like even in obviously we're going to have to do a part 4 of this now. Even in 1940, at the end of 1941, December 1941 to 1942, the reason the Japanese had such an easy time in Malaya and Singapore and Burma was because Churchill wouldn't send any British forces there. Because he was much more worried about fighting Germany in the Middle East than he was about defending British possessions over there in the Far East. And he was also much more worried about sending modern British fighter aircraft and every single spare British tank to Stalin than he was about sending them to British forces in the Far East. Now, this is Stalin, who Churchill apparently was this enormous anti-communist, but he was willing to get thousands of British Royal Navy and Merchant Navy sailors killed in these deadly Arctic convoys in order to send Stalin stuff, much of which was left to rot in Archangel when he got there.
That transition from his previously anti-Bolshevik attitude, and he really, like, in the early 20s, he really stood out, like, very creditably, I would say, in among a lot of other people who just didn't really see any threat in the Soviet Union. He stood out as anti-Soviet in the early 20s. That transition from that position to being pro-Stalin, and he literally did become pro-Stalin during the war, that deserves a lot of examination. There should be a book about that, I think. The sort of like the stages by which he went from one to the other, because
but as we spoke about in earlier episodes, Horus, Churchill was also at that same time in the 1920s stopping the Royal Navy from properly fortifying the Singapore naval base because he was Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Yeah, this.
To me, Churchill, if you really want to understand Churchill, you've got to go right back to 1908 when he crossed the floor over imperial tariff preference and left the Conservative Party and joined the Liberals. Because imperial tariff preference was really the last opportunity to turn the British Empire into something real. And in particular, the old Commonwealth, which is to say Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and back then South Africa as well.
Those the good bits of the empire, the bits.
Yeah, the bits that were worth turning into something real, that could have had an imperial parliament and all this kind of stuff, and a common foreign and defence policy, all this stuff. And Churchill was totally against that. Didn't support it at all. Ron Muller in the chat says, "Hey, you guys got 50 obsolete destroyers." This was the destroyers for bases deal, and those destroyers were so shit. Most of them weren't even operational for like 18 months to 2 years. But
they literally used them to ram dry docks in France. And
well, that was probably the best. That was the best use one of them was put to. Yeah. Yes, for sure. Right. For sure. Ataman, you haven't said much for a while, mate. I reckon we've probably got about 20 minutes to go. What's your opinion on what we've been talking about so far this evening?
Well, James L., just a little bit further up, actually made a good point where he said Britain declared war but did nothing for a year. There's often this point that people point out, which is true, which is that it was Neville Chamberlain that declared war, but not Churchill. But the sort of war Chamberlain seemed to envision was very different to Churchill. Churchill wanted to jump in and immediately ramp it up. Neville Chamberlain seemed to want to keep it very much within a certain boundary. I think he was still very much hoping that that some sort of peace could be made out of it.
No, I don't disagree with that. I mean, look, I would say, why was Neville Chamberlain overturned? Well, it was Norway, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And who was the main villain of Norway from the British point of view? Who was in charge of the Admiralty? Churchill.
Mm-hmm.
He got away with it totally.
I do wonder if that was, partly deliberate. If he somehow anticipated that he'd be able to hang that around Chamberlain's neck, because certainly, there's that famous moment where Chamberlain, I think he's announcing the sort of failure of the Norway campaign. I can't remember it. Yeah, I think that's right. Or he's announcing the beginning of the German invasion of France, and Leo Amery, who was a close ally of Churchill.
When he says, "For God's sake, go."
For God's sake, man, go! And it's almost as though he's doing that. Just he's doing.
Although
that on
Leo Amory, to be entirely fair, was of course a very, very big ally of Winston Churchill.
Yeah. Close friends, scheming to bring down Chamberlain for years before.
A member of the Focus and all this stuff.
Right.
Absolutely right.
Right.
Look, guys, I want to make this very clear because I know it's going to get confusing to people. Like, I know Horus has his own views, and of course Ataman has his own views. But my view, just me, not the channel, just me, not the other two gentlemen who are streaming with me. I don't care about the moral stuff around World War II very much. What I care about is that it was the total destruction of Britain as a great power in the British Empire. That's what I care about. The rest of it, I don't care about most of it.
Do you know?
Although, let me just say this: I'm like in general terms, I'm against killing women and children in war.
Go on, Atman. Go on.
No. You go.
Well, just when you first said that, Duke, I thought, well, I agree, except I do care about morals as well. But I read The Prince by Machiavelli a few years ago, and he says, like, there's an image of Machiavelli where he just doesn't care about morality, but it's not true. He says, you think about virtue once your power is secured, and of course, this was the unsecuring of British power all around the world. And thus, morality, our beliefs, and I think Britain, has a lot to contribute morally to the world, or sets a good example at least, like through history. But our morals just don't matter anymore because we don't have any power. It doesn't matter how good or decent we are.
Exactly right, Horus. I mean, look, like I said, I'm basically against killing women and children in war if you can avoid it. You can't always. You absolutely cannot always. But if you can, let's avoid that if we can. Although feminism is not in favour of that. Feminism wants you to treat women the same as men. So, But
I mean, would you agree that there had been a certain civilizing of war in the preceding century or two that was undone? This is perhaps provocative, but there was undone chiefly by Churchill's, desire to bomb German cities.
No, I wouldn't agree with that at all. I think Germany started that before we did. Germany bombed London in World War One, first with Zeppelins and later on with Gotha bombers and stuff like that. Germany had bombed the shit out of various places in Spain. Germany bombed the shit out of Rotterdam. This is one thing where I will part company with you, to be honest. I think Germany started indiscriminate bombing of civilians before Britain did. Britain under Chamberlain was dropping leaflets on Germany.
No, those were crimes. I'd forgotten about the German attacks on British civilians in the First World War. I mean that
just the same as the German high seas fleet would send a couple of battle cruisers over and bombard the shit out of some defenseless British seaside town in World War One. The Germans were always happy to do that. So I'm not going to say British guilt for that shit because it's not true.
Well, not British in the same way as you said about the American people that academic agents been.
No, I'm not going to take British government shit for that either because it's not
what
true.
About
the Germans did it first. Listen, my dad was born in London in 1933, and his home was bomb flat by the Luftwaffe in 1940 during the nighttime blitz. That was the Germans. I'm sorry, that wasn't the Brits. That was the Germans.
Was it the Germans first? I mean,
yes,
because that is important.
Yes, it was. Germany did it starting in late 1915, early 1916 with their Zeppelins.
That's unambiguous.
The Germans were
I agree with you.
The Germans were the first people in the world to bomb civilians from the air.
I totally agree that those were crimes, and it's legitimate to strike back against that. I mean, ideally not in kind, but still, it's understandable to strike back in kind. Those were crimes, but that was under a different regime. Obviously, we'd had Weimar in between, and we had Hitler's regime. Arguably, you could say that's not relevant.
Like I said, people will get the wrong idea from history. There'll be some nat socks at people who will think, oh yeah, like somehow or other Iron Duke is now pro AH. Not true, mate.
I don't think nobody mistakes you for a sympathiser of Hitler.
I don't like AH at all. All I do is recognise he's not much worse than Stalin. And that Britain was ridiculous for getting in the war when she did, in the way she did.
What about the anger campaign run by the BBC at Churchill's instigation? I think that is pretty clear evidence that it was.
Sorry, I don't know what that is, Horus. Please explain.
Yeah, well, it's not that much mentioned, but it is. I can't remember if it's mentioned in Buchanan or where I read about it, but like Churchill, pretty much demanded that the BBC run an anger campaign to incite hatred of Germans to help convince the British people, because they weren't convinced of it, that Britain should be attacking German cities, like the dehousing program. This doesn't directly address the question.
And then, of course, at the end of World War II, the one major part of the British Armed Forces that were not given a campaign medal was RAF Bomber Command.
Really? What?
Yeah, they were the only major. And you know what? If you were a British Armed Forces bloke in World War II, the most dangerous thing to be in, your largest chance of dying, was Bomber Command.
Terrible losses.
They lost 58,000 dead people, and more than that wounded and captured. But 58,000 dead. Your chances of completing a 30-mission tour with RAF Bomber Command were very, very minimal.
Something that Bowden points out is that Bomber Harris got politicians to sign documents to basically say that the Bomber Command or the bombers themselves wouldn't be held responsible for.
He thought he was going to be betrayed, didn't he? He thought the RAF was going to be blamed by the politicians. The politicians.
Well, they were, and they were. Churchill, very quickly backpedaled on area bombing after World War II.
What a scoundrel! It's unbelievable. Harris was a fucking warrior, and just.
He was also a Rhodesian, by the way. But yeah, Richard Ford is asking me my thoughts on area bombing. It didn't work. If you bomb civilians in a reasonably homogeneous society, where people trust each other, as was the case in Britain in World War II and Germany in World War II, people just come together, which is what the Germans found when they did the nighttime blitz on Germany and what the British found when they bombed Germany. People just became better friends and were more determined to resist. Area bombing didn't work. It might work against assorted brown people in third world nations who have all this other shit going on and don't have any air defense, but it didn't work in World War II at all. The only time it did was when even then it's dubious, was when the Yanks dropped atom bombs on Japanese cities that were absolutely defenseless by that stage, pretty much. Although, let us not forget, the Americans in World War II killed far more Japanese with firebombing for their wooden and paper houses than they did with their 2 nuclear bombs.
As I have to finish very soon, do you want to do another part to this, and we can?
Yeah, we must do another part, maybe, because I really want to get to 1942 on this, because my main bit about this is how Churchill badly fought World War II.
And we could have a bit of fisticuffs if we both read up in between, prepare.
Well, look, mate, the book, as I said, the only book apart from the one this is mostly based on, I would recommend, is The Last 1,000 Days of the British Empire. That is, if you read that, that really explains a lot of it in a quite subtle way.
I have to go back to that. I read the first chapter. I need to return to that book. Yeah.
It's a damn good book. It really is.
Yeah, it was very interesting.
But look, as I said, anyone in the chat who's getting the idea at all, kumquat, empire in I presume that's an anti-Jewish thing you're doing there. Yeah, get fucked, mate. We already spoke about this. Many people in the British Empire were not particularly pro-Zionist at all. And even if they were, I don't care because I'm pro-British Empire, so get fucked. But you know what? Don't get this wrong, gents. Because I know some people already have. I've already been accused of speaking to the wrong people. Wrong in inverted commas, by the way, by people who presume to know more than I do. That somehow or another, I'm somehow pro-Nazi, and that's the worst thing in the entire world. Look, I'm not pro-Nazi in the least. I detest Adolf Hitler. He was a mass murderer. Don't like him. Anti-British. He didn't do Britain any favours whatsoever. And I detest him. All right? I just don't think he was much worse than Stalin. That's all I think.
Yeah. But can I point out, because someone asked in chat, were there no statues to Bomber Harris? There is one somewhere in London.
Yeah,
I'm
there
not
is.
sure whereabouts. It was actually on that group that was trying to like take down the sort of the quote unquote slavers.
Yep. Yeah.
He was on their shit list for a while. I can't really work out why. But you know, clearly their Jewish overlords hadn't informed them properly about who should and shouldn't be on the list.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a statue too now that was only put up, I don't know, in the 80s or 90s, I think.
It's up by the Queen Mother, wasn't it?
To bomber command.
Oh, right, yeah.
There's a statue of a few aircrew dudes. You had, like I said, if you really wanted to die in World War II as a Brit, you joined Bomber Command. They had much the highest losses.
I just had a look. What you said there reminds me of that bit in Blackadder Goes Forth when he says the 20 minuters because the life expectancy is 20 minutes. I just a brilliant series. I just looked up the statue of Arthur Harris is at St Clement Danes Church on the Strand, which is the official church of the RAF or the central church of the RAF. Also, the burial place of Harold Harefoot from like the I think he was king of England in the 1040s, I think.
Cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he's got his statue is at the RAF's own church on the Strand.
And I would also point out
it's from 1992. So yeah.
Yeah, all this is very recent. And I would also point out that Harris was a Rhodesian as well. And after the war, he returned to Rhodesia to retire. And he was always very upset that his men alone didn't get a campaign medal for World War II.
Was there a reason given for them being left out of that?
Well, Churchill was embarrassed about bombing German cities and killing women and children. But of course, that was never admitted, but that was the reason.
Unbelievable.
And these dudes didn't know this. Like, you got to understand, these dudes were like in their late teens and early 20s. Like the 7 blokes who flew every Lancaster or Halifax. They were all like late teens, early 20s, and they were told they were bombing military targets. That's what they were told. And the German flak, which was the AAA guns, the anti-aircraft guns, and even more, the German night fighters were entirely deadly. And all these British bombers had to defend them were a few .303 rifle caliber machine guns. And if the gunners were not spot on and really awake, and they were mostly freezing, by the way, because like there was no heating in these aircraft and they were like 25,000 feet up in the air. If they were not totally spot on and awake, these German aircraft fly under them, and they had these 20 millimeter cannon that fired upwards at an angle. They were called jazz music by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. And these 20 millimeter cannons, they could fire underneath an RAF plane, which had a rear gunner, a mid-upper gunner, and a nose gunner, but nobody else. They didn't have a gunner underneath. They could fly underneath the RAF plane and just blow it to smithereens. And all of these Royal Air Force boys, and they really were boys, like hardly any of them were over 25, all thought the Germans had a thing called a scarecrow shell, which looked like an exploding aircraft. The fact was, the Germans never had a scarecrow shell. They were all exploding aircraft.
Bloody hell.
Exploding RAF bombers. All of them. They were very brave young men. They really were.
Can you imagine
there's a really, really awful line, I think, in the penultimate chapter of Hitchens's Phony Victory, where he says, people ask me if the bomber runs were so bad, why did none of the bombers write about it in their memoirs? And he just says, because none of them lived long enough to.
Much truth. Can I just point out that James L says, Richard Ford, Peter, Butcher Harris. Do you know why the RAF crews called him Butcher Harris?
No.
And they didn't hate him. They called him Butcher Harris because so many of them died. It was British humour.
Guys, I don't want to stop you, but do you mind if I drop out at this point? I need to do some things before I get to bed.
No worries. Look, do you want to do the next stream, Horus, next week or the week after?
I think next week's no good for me, but maybe the week after, if that's okay. Yeah.
Would that suit you, Armin?
Yeah.
All right, Horus, we will see you then, and Armin and I will finish up.
Great stuff. Thanks, guys. All right, really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us, Horus. Go well, man.
All right, speak soon.
Ataman, you haven't spoken that much on this, so your view on what we've been talking about this evening, basically.
I've given most of mine already, but it's. I mean, the bomber command stuff is particularly quite harrowing. There was one thing you said earlier, but I couldn't really come back on it because I can't remember the exact details. But there's a bit in Peter Hitchens' Phony Victory as well when he talks about a sort of ideological battle between two particular guys, one of which was the guy who was part of the team inventing radar. And the other guy was some sort of Air Force guy.
Churchill is one of them, isn't he?
Yeah. And one was the sort of Air Force guy from the First World War who Churchill was friends with.
Yeah.
And the Air Force guy was very anti-German.
And they found out that up until 1940, I think it was midway between about 1942, that most RAF bombers over Germany didn't come within about 30 miles of their target. Is that what you're talking about, Adam?
Yeah, but he was still pushing for bombings anyway. Basically saying to Churchill it was the working strategy rather than a more defensive strategy of using radar.
Oh, look, people were saying in the chat that Britain was bombing Germany before the Blitz, which actually wasn't true, by the way. But
we bombed military targets specifically.
We absolutely did try and bomb German docks and German naval ports and this kind of thing. Yes, we did, but by and large, didn't hit them. Because at night, most RAF bombers until the middle of 1942 didn't drop their bombs within 30 miles of their target.
Yeah.
Literally, they just couldn't find them because they're crawling around over Europe at night with no radar and just some dude trying to work out where we are with wind speeds and compasses and so on. It just didn't work.
Yeah, and on top of that, of course, the bombs are just completely unguided. They can just go anywhere once you've released them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most RAF bombs landed in fields.
And the same for the Germans because, I live in the southeast and our woods around here are littered with bomb craters where they would just be trying to hit, let's say, Canterbury and places like that.
Well, look,
they were just hitting the open fields around.
Yeah, I can tell you, Ataman, that I was born in inner South London, quite close to Tower Bridge, and when I was a kid in the early 1970s, Britain that part of London still had loads of bomb sites, which were literally buildings that had been blown up by the Germans. But the reason for that was, if you were the German Air Force, you could fly up the Thames And then eventually you'd see this great big thing, which was London, which was the world's biggest city in those days.
Yeah.
Whereas if you were trying to bomb Berlin, Berlin was like enormous, not as big as London, but it was enormous. But there was no great big river leading to it that you could follow.
Yeah, I mean, they were flying across like open countryside for miles and miles and miles.
Yeah, so even when the RAF started bombing Germany in 1940, yeah, a few bombs fell on Berlin, but they were scattered all over the place and did almost no damage. I mean, they made the Germans take the piss out of Hermann Goering because, like he said, no enemy bomb will ever fall on Berlin. But they didn't do much damage to the Germans. The real damage that was done to the German Reich from area bombing only really happened in late 1943 onwards.
Yeah. I also point out, of course, that British bomber crews were, despite all their disadvantages, still more successful generally.
Oh, look, the guys were good. They were well trained. Many of them were trained in Canada and Australia. Many of them were Canadians and Australians or New Zealanders or South Africans. All of those guys took part in Bomber Command. I think they were the bravest of the brave. I'm never going to slag those guys off. I don't agree.
And of course they had the RAF been racking up.
I don't agree with area bombing. I don't think it was a good plan. It didn't work. But the blokes who did it were the bravest of the brave.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I mean, as well, the RAF have been racking up loads of experience during the interwar years in colonies and doing all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, we used to fly over some tribal village and drop leaflets on the place and say, "Your mullah is being naughty."
Yeah,
leave.
But they'd still get way more hours in the air than the German equivalent, though.
Yeah, but they would also they drop these leaflets and they say, "Your mullah has been very naughty and is anti-British. If you don't leave in 24 hours, we're going to bomb you." But they would warn them first. It's all quite civilized, really.
I mean, James Earl is probably right that we probably had no business bombing Berlin, but you know, that does kind of go both ways. The whole thing was probably largely avoidable, and that's kind of the whole grotesque thing of it.
Richard Ford says, "Bowden, you never condemn the warrior." Quite right. That's the bloke who's risking his life. Quite right.
Yeah.
Quite right. Any final thoughts, Simon?
No. We'll save it for next time.
All right, we didn't get anywhere near as far on the stream as I hoped we would, but I suppose I should have guessed that. So we'll do a part 4, not next week, but the week after. If you look in the description, people in the chat, you will find Horus's social media links if you'd like to follow them up. Ataman, anything you wanted to plug before we go?
No, nothing from me.
All right. For me, I will just say we will be back on Saturday, as always, with Splendid Isolation. And this week, we are going to do, not entirely, but partially, a Northern Ireland special. So join us for that.
Oh, I will actually quickly add, I have started a second YouTube channel called Bowden Bomber, where I'm posting just a few little Bowden clips. They're ones I've made for TikTok, but I'm also re-uploading them to YouTube.
Do me a favor, Alan. Can you DM me that on Discord?
Yeah,
I'll
sure.
stick it, and I'll stick it in the description and follow you as well. All right, folks. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time for Splendid Isolation. I don't know, what is it, 92 or something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
Been going for quite a while. Anyway, see you later, guys. Go well.